These last few weeks we've been talking about God's personal attributes. And so we looked at his omniscience, we looked at his omnipotence, and now we're going to look at God's holiness, or his moral attributes. And so, come on in. And so the first attribute of God's moral character is his holiness. And so the first thing that we'll do is look at the scriptural data relevant to this attribute, which is what we do with every attribute, is we look first at the scriptural data, see what we can glean from the scriptures, and then move beyond it. So the first thing is God is the grounding of morality, or of moral obligations, and that's what I have written on the as the first the subcategory here. And so this, it seems to me, is the implication of Romans 9:14 through 21. And so if you want to write that down, you can. Romans 9:14 through 21. And there Paul is talking about the call of God upon the lives of Jacob and the rejection of Esau. And so he says, "What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God, who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show you my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? And so here Paul says that God's election is based on his own sovereign decision. He has mercy on whomever he wills. He hardens whomever he wills. There is, in essence, no higher court of appeals above God. And so it would seem that God is the source of our moral obligations. If there is no court of appeals beyond God, then God is the arbiter. He's the source of our moral obligations. One cannot bring God before the bar of some higher justice to say that this is unjust on God's part. And again, why? Because God himself is the highest court of appeal. We can't go beyond God. God is therefore the source of rightness and justice and righteousness. He cannot be brought before any higher court of appeal or any higher bar of justice. And so God is not answerable to anyone outside of himself. And so that is the implication, I think, that is there in Romans 9:14 through 21. And let me just mention briefly what I was talking to Conroy about, where it says in the Bible, when it says God hardens this person's heart. This is a controversial issue, but when I was looking into it yesterday, it does seem that when God says that he's going to do something, if we take into account that God has middle knowledge, which is a thing that we talked about a couple weeks back, it's a part of God's foreknowledge. Middle knowledge is what we would do if we were placed in certain situations. Like he knew that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times. He knew that at the beginning of the world. And this is if God does have this knowledge, then what he can do is bring about certain things without impugning or without impinging on our free will. Because he knows what we would do if we were placed in certain situations. And so he can bring about some end without interfering with our free will. And so that's one way to look at these passages when we see that God is hardening someone's heart, is that he's still bringing about some end, but he doesn't necessarily have to take away their free will to do so when it says that he's hardening their hearts. He's bringing about some end. Maybe he's giving them up to their own desires, their own free will, but he's still bringing about that end. Right, that he's saying that otherwise he's hardening his heart for this goal to bring about something else. He can still bring that about without interfering with our free will. I just wanted to mention that on the side, because when we look at that passage, it does seem a little bit difficult at first to sort of reconcile that with some things might pop up in our minds of like, why would God want to do that if he's perfectly loving? And so we can interpret it that way if God does have this middle knowledge. And I think that is a very plausible way to understand it. Anyways, let's move on to the second point, which is that the scriptures indicate that God is absolutely holy. He's absolutely holy. And let's look at Exodus 3 through 5. I've got other handouts here. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm going to give them their own. Morning. Here you go. I'll get another one for him. And so the second point is that the scriptures indicate that God is absolutely holy. And so we're going to look at Exodus 3 through 5. And this is the appearance to Moses on the part of God in the burning bush. The burning bush. And so in Exodus 3 through 5, and Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that, he turned aside to see. God called out to him in the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And so the presence of God made that ground so holy that he couldn't even have his sandals on it. Right? And so it seems to be obvious that God is completely holy if he requires something like that. Let's look at also Leviticus 19, verse 2. Leviticus 19, verse 2. It says, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. And so here God commands the people, God's command to the people is that his holiness should be reflected in their lives. It says, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I am holy. You are to be holy because I'm holy. And so finally, let's look at one other verse for the second point here. And that's in the last book of the Bible, Revelation chapter 4, verse 8. Chapter 4, verse 8. It says, And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, who was and is to come. And so God, I think it's obvious that God is absolutely holy by these scriptures. And so that is then the basis for the holiness that should characterize our own lives. Number 3, God's holiness serves to expose man's sinfulness. God's holiness serves to expose man's sinfulness. The first verse for this one is Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 5. And this is the vision of God that Isaiah had in the temple. It says, In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And so here the vision of God's awesome holiness creates in Isaiah a deep sense of his own uncleanliness and unrighteousness by comparison with God's holiness that filled the temple. The incredible purity of God serves to expose our wickedness and our own sinfulness. Number 4, God's holiness separates man from God. His holiness separates man from God. That is another reason that God is not just a being among many beings. He is the only being that is completely holy. And so therefore we are separated from God in that sense. Let's look at the prophet Habakkuk. Habakkuk 1, verses 13. That's near the New Testament if you're looking it up. It says, the prophet says of the Lord, You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. That's the first part of the verse. It says, You are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. And so God is too holy to behold evil. He cannot look upon wrongdoing because of his holiness. And so therefore, as a result, because we are wrongdoers and we are sinful, are spiritually separated from him as a result. And then in Isaiah 59, verses 1 and 2, it expresses the same thing very well.
That verse?
Habakkuk 1, verse 13. Chapter 1, verse 13.
Thanks.
And then in Isaiah 59, chapter 59, verses 1 through 2, express the same thing very well. It says, Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, or his ear dull, that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. And so here Isaiah is basically saying the problem is not on God's part. It's on our own part. He's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he can do, whatever. The only limits on him are logical limits. And so he can hear your prayers. The failing is not therefore with God, it's with us. It's that our sin and our wickedness have created this chasm, this separation between us and God. And so that he does not hear our prayers because of that, is what Isaiah is saying here. And so the holiness of God serves to separate sinful man from God's fellowship and presence. God's holiness disperses evil just as light disperses darkness. They cannot abide together. And so we're going to go ahead and open it up for discussion before we move on to the systematic summary of these verses. If you have any comments or questions so far, yeah.
Number 4. So it's safe to say that the only thing that can separate us from God is sin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess we could base it on he had to turn his back on his son, Jesus Christ.
Right.
Carrying our sin.
Yeah.
And how he loved his son, but he couldn't.
And that's because God is perfectly holy.
Right.
Right. He's perfectly holy. He has no sin, and so those two things are in opposition, right? And so, but wherever God is, sin is not. So.
That's right.
Yeah. Go ahead. No. Go ahead.
No. Are we to assume, or I wouldn't say assume, to know that during that time with the Old Testament, it seems that rebelliousness and disobedience caused, God to give His wrath. Because you look back at all the flood.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Israelites going through what they went through.
Right.
And so we're saying that it was sin.
It was absolutely it was sin. It was right. Yeah, it was God's. It was God's righteous judgment, just as we would cast judgment on a criminal. There are certain things that we have in place, certain repercussions, consequences of our actions, and that's one of the way that we are able to live in a society with laws. And so we can live in a peaceful society because we have these consequences. If you do this and this, you're going to jail. You might face the death penalty. So we have these things in place to deter people from doing these wrong things. But at the same time, it's sort of incompatible with justice if God just lets this stuff happen. And so there are times when God intervenes. And so, and then at the end, what God did was He actually became incarnate, and He took on the sins of the world when He didn't have to.
Right.
Good morning.
Morning.
I asked this question at our gathering.
Okay.
And so, because God is holy and we are to be holy as
Mm-hmm.
He is,
Mm-hmm.
how is holiness manifest, demonstrated? What determines what's holy and what's unholy? How do we act?
Right.
What's
So
holy?
holiness is what I suggested in that meeting was that holiness is synonymous with sinlessness. So wherever there is sin, there is not holiness. But also where there is not sin, there is goodness. Right, and so we are at the very core, because we are sinful in our nature. We are not good. We're a good thing to create, but we are not in ourselves. We are sinful. We are sinful beings, the fall of man. And so I would say that holiness is synonymous with goodness. And so when we want to understand, what is the content of holiness, we can just look at what God is. God is love. And that's part of what it means to say that God is perfectly good, is that He's perfectly loving, right? He always wants the best for us. And so that would be the easy answer, is that I would say that God, the content of holiness is to be sinless, and then also to be perfectly good, which is to be perfectly loving. And so we all have a basic understanding of what it means to be loving, right? And being loving doesn't mean that you're just going to pamper someone. It means that you're going to do what's best for them. And what's best for someone might be to allow them to suffer. If I was to just walk around and make sure that Cammie doesn't do anything her entire life, that probably wouldn't be as good as if I let her go and figure some things out on her own, right? And so sometimes we have to allow them the freedom to learn things for themselves. And so love is compatible with allowing that person to suffer to some extent, right? Not just to be and not just to suffer indefinitely, but to suffer to some extent, right? It's compatible. Yeah,
learn.
yeah, exactly.
And I'm coming from the background of a holiness, quote unquote, holiness traditional apostolic church, where we were to live holy, and that had restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't go here, we didn't go there, we didn't do this, we didn't do that,
Mm-hmm.
because we were to live holy, and that was what we equated holiness
So
with.
that's still compatible with being sinless, right? And so they would consider those things sin, and so to be holy, you don't want to avoid sin, because holiness is sinlessness. So it would be the sort of same thing, but that sort of standard, I think, is who's going to live up to that other than Jesus? You know, that's not to say that we're just going to encourage people to go around sinning, but once you start placing these, once you start judging people based on these things that they're doing, it gets real muddy, I think, real quick, because we all have things that we deal with, even though we think that we're righteous. That was one of the things that was the downfall of the Pharisees, is that they thought that they were just completely righteous. There's actually a name for it. It's called moralism. And there's a lot of Christians that get wrapped up in this moralism, where they think that everyone has to act a certain way, and that they are just these perfect, they do all these things, and so they're going to judge everyone else. And so that opposite end of it, we need to realize that we are all sinful. Even thinking that we are righteous is a sin. And so I'm going to get off of that soapbox.
Big old one.
But you said that is so true, because that was me.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up the same, as my sister is. So I would put you in hell in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, if I would put you in hell quick,
Yeah.
I would tell you that.
Right.
But in my mind,
There was a book that I read a while ago when I was at Bible school, and it was not something that they suggested to read, but it was just something I found in the bookstore. It was amazing. It was this guy's vision that he had of like traveling up this mountain, but it was a complete vision that he described. And he said that once he got to the top of this mountain, he had to avoid certain like sins and stuff along the way. But when he got to the top, he was there with all of these great, other people of the faith. And so these great people that were doing all these great things in the kingdom. And so, but what happened was they put on these huge, these golden robes, and then they got taken away by these demons. And the reason why is because they were prideful. And so that was their ultimate downfalls. When they got to that level, it was pride, and that was the worst of everything. And it was like these demons came in and grabbed them. And I may not be describing that. I don't remember the book exactly, but the way that he avoided that was to put on this ugly, filthy garment that he put on over his golden robe. And so that's how he avoided it. And that's humility. It was symbolic of humility. But so the point of that is, I think that people, they think that they're righteous, they think that they're holy, but really what's happening is that they're just completely prideful. And they're completely blind to it as well, which is even worse. So someone who is completely sinning, but they at least recognize that, I'm a sinner. Obviously I'm not. But that's completely different from someone who is up there and they think that they're just a righteous person, when they're just completely enveloped in pride. And sin is just the complete, the pinnacle of their life. And so that's a real, that's the real failing of moralism, I think.
And some people, they will raise you and grow you up in there.
Mm-hmm.
To where, every little thing that you do is wrong, and then they teach you to judge other people.
Yeah.
And you will have a high standard of living.
Yeah.
Because you've been taught well. And you will have a disciplined life because you've been taught well. But the root, what it does over time, it does grow an inner pridefulness, in my case.
Yeah.
It was an inner pridefulness and it was more self-righteousness, actually. And it wasn't that I thought I was better than other people. It's that I knew that I could master certain sins because I was victorious and I practiced doing it long.
Yeah.
So, and practice does make permanent over time. But when you kind of see from God's lens how nasty sin is, how ugly it is, you do, want to share with people, hey, man, that's not cool, that's not real. And then I got to the point to where, hey, you share, the gospel with some people and you leave it alone.
And another thing to realize, and this is, I don't know if it's getting too off topic, but when we do something for something other than to please God, then it's actually for the wrong reasons. Right. So if we do it because we want to get some reward in heaven, then that's actually a bad reason. That's not a very good, that's not a moral reason to do something. And so, but often, when we're doing these things and we want to act good and stuff, it's because we may want a better reward in heaven. I want a bigger mansion or whatever, and so, and that motivation, other than just doing it for God, and a lot of times we don't even know what our real motivation is, that they're rooted in insecurity. We want to do things to look good in other people's eyes. Or we want to attain that, eternal happiness and heaven and do all this stuff. And so we want to do this and that. But we need to realize that we're not saved by works. Right? Nothing that we do on this earth is ever going to be good enough. And so, that's not to say that we should just go around sinning everywhere. Even though if we did that, then we would still fall under God's grace because of what he did on the cross. But there's another reason that we want to be righteous is because God is righteous. And we want to be like him. And that is also going to build our character. And that is something that is going to carry over into the next life, is our character. That's one of the reasons, probably the biggest reasons that we're here on this earth, as opposed to just being sent straight to heaven, is because God wants to give us this opportunity to shape our character. Otherwise, that we wouldn't have the opportunity to do. So let's go ahead and move on to the systematic summary of holiness. And we're going to cover a really interesting subject, which is an objection to theistic grounded morality. There's an argument for God based on morality, which we're going to discuss in the next few weeks. And so there's an objection that you often see to this. And the first subject, or the first category at the top, is that God is the grounding of moral obligations. And what we saw that in Romans 9, 14 through 21. And so, but atheists will sometimes object to this with what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And the principal problem with this, or what it says, is it was actually a dialogue that Plato wrote several thousand years ago. And it was set in a polytheistic context. They had a lot of gods back then. And so it was set, and it went like this. It said, do the gods love something because it is good, or is it good because the gods love it? This was Plato's question, and it was supposed to undermine the theistic ethic. And so, again, he was posing it in a polytheistic context, so I'm going to pose it in a contemporary context, where we all mostly believe in a monotheistic God. We don't believe in many gods, right, unless you're a Mormon. Which is true. They believe in, Jesus, and you're going to be able to become a Jesus one day. And so did God, this is in the case of rape, Walter in a Senate Armstrong asks it like this. He says, did God have a reason to command this? If not, if God had no reason to command it, his command was arbitrary if he had no reason. And then it can't make anything morally wrong. On the other hand, if God did have a reason to command us not to rape, then that reason is what makes rape morally wrong. The command itself is superfluous. It's unnecessary. Either way, morality cannot depend on God's commands. This is the objection that an atheist raises to theistic grounded morality. And so a dilemma in and of itself is basically just a difficult choice between two options. That's what a dilemma is. And so the first horn, or the first option of this, and you can see it there, A, says that if God has no reason, it says God has no reason. This is saying that these are your two options. Either God has no reason, or he does have a reason, and those reasons are therefore necessary or sufficient for morality. You don't need God's commands. And so if God has no reasons, that would be to say that God could just command whatever he wanted. He could command that rape is good. And so therefore we would have the moral obligation to rape and be uncruel to others. And so that's the first one, is that it seems to be arbitrary. That God's commands are, if there is no reason that God commanded this or that, then it's completely arbitrary. He could have commanded something else, and that is completely unacceptable. To think that rape could be morally obligatory is just completely like, you're going to abandon that theory of morality way before you're going to accept that rape is good. Right, and so that's really the objection. And so on the second hand, B option, the B option, is that if God does have reasons for commanding what he does, then those reasons are what make something morally wrong. For instance, if God commanded that rape is wrong because it causes serious emotional and physical harm to the victim, then that's really the reason why it was wrong. Not because God commanded it, but because of that reason. Not because God willed it, but because it causes serious harm. And so God's commands aren't needed. And this is the objection. And so before we move on to a response to this dilemma, which there are tons of responses in the literature, we're going to cover one today. Are there any questions on the dilemma itself, how we understand the dilemma, why it's a dilemma to theistic grounded morality? Do you have any questions on that? Everyone understands the dilemma, the option between A and B, or the supposed option between A and B that we're supposedly got to deal with?
Okay, so you're saying that God has reasons, and because of those reasons, that's why something is morally wrong.
Those reasons are what makes something morally wrong. It is the objection.
Okay.
Is that it's either God doesn't have any reasons for commanding what he does, and therefore his commands are arbitrary. He could have commanded that rape is good, and we would be obligated to rape others. And so option A seems untenable. We can't really hold that one. But if God does have reasons, then the objection goes. Then those reasons are really what makes it morally wrong, not God's commands. So that's the dilemma that atheists pose to theists. And this is something that will pop up when we discuss the argument for God from morality.
Okay, so for the first argument, which means that they would defy the Ten Commandments. If they probably don't know it.
I want to shelf those questions right now. I want to make sure that we're on the same page with the dilemma. Make sure that we understand why it seems like there's only these two options that we've got to contend with, and then once we understand that, then we'll look at responses to it.
Okay.
So yeah, as long as we understand the dilemma, then we can move on to a solution to it. Okay.
Just think about it. When we're growing up, and your mother says, "Don't do that,"
Right.
and then you ask mom why.
Mm-hmm.
And mom says, because I said so.
Yeah.
No explanation.
Yeah.
No reason.
Mm-hmm.
Just I said so.
Mm-hmm.
So is that A or B or neither?
Because she said that would actually fall into the solution, I would think. And I'll explain why. You'll understand why the solution. And I haven't written the solution on here yet because I want you to write it down. And so the solution, I think, to this problem. Well, first of all, let me explain this. That the Euthyphro problem. The typical response is that it's a false dilemma. Okay, and so a false dilemma is basically to say that there's another option. It's not that it's not an option between A or not A. It's an option between A and B. And so if we can locate some other option, C, then we could say that C is the option that we should take instead of A or B. Right, and so that's the typical response. And so that if we have an option C, which I'm going to offer here, then we can still hold that God is the ground of morality, and we don't have to deal with these problems that arise otherwise. So, and there's a lot of different solutions that are offered in the literature, but this is the one that I find most plausible, most interesting. And there are other ones, but this is the one that I'm going to give in class. So the solution is God has reasons for his commands. God has reasons for his commands, but these reasons are not sufficient. But these reasons are not sufficient by themselves in explaining moral obligations. So God has reasons for his commands, but these reasons are not sufficient by themselves in explaining moral obligations. So God does have reasons for his commands, but these reasons are not sufficient by themselves in explaining moral obligations. And so that's essentially just to deny B, is to say that B is basically saying that the reasons are sufficient, and then C is saying that those reasons are actually not sufficient to constitute our moral obligations. And so I'm going to explain that just a little bit. And so if C is true, then actions do not have the property of being morally obligatory without God's commands. No action has that property. But they can have other relevant properties, such as being morally good or even reflecting God's perfectly loving nature. God's actual commanding, so like when your mom commands it, is what gives it that property of being obligatory. right? So that is when the obligation arises. And so to use a legal analogy, consider the legal obligation not to smoke in certain areas when implemented by law. For the legal obligation to arise, there of course must be good reasons behind why it is implemented by the law. For instance, so secondhand smoke can still cause cancer. Okay, and so that's a really good reason for the law to be there to prohibit smoking in certain areas where it's heavily populated. But again, that reason itself is not sufficient to constitute the obligation, the legal obligation, right? And so we still have to have a legal obligation. It has to be implemented by the law in order to actually be a legal obligation, right? That reason itself that it can cause secondhand smoke can cause cancer. That reason is not itself sufficient to give rise to a legal obligation. Right, and so we've got to have some other thing that we add to that reason, that constitutes an obligation or a legal obligation. And so that would be the law, right? The process of signing a law into to order, right? And so that whole process is what gives rise to that legal obligation. And so what the theist would say, or the Christian, what we would say is that those reasons, God still has those reasons, for instance, that rape causes needless harm to people. But that reason is not sufficient in itself to explain obligations, that God's command or God's will is still necessary to constitute that obligation, that moral obligation. And then another example is you can think of, it's good to be a lifeguard in order to save lives. Right, that's good. That's a good thing to do if you wanted to become a lifeguard to save lives, or even think about a doctor. So if you wanted to become a doctor in order to save lives, that's a good thing to do. But we're not obligated to do that, right? And so there's got to be some other thing that is added to that constitutes an obligation. Okay, and so what we would say is that that's a command, that's God's command, is what constitutes a moral obligation, as opposed to just something that's morally good or morally bad. Right, and so those reasons that God has, God can still have reasons for commanding this or that. And some of those reasons could be grounded in God's will, or not in God's will, God's perfectly loving nature. And so God is a perfectly loving being. And so some of those reasons could be grounded in those, in God's perfectly loving will. Right, and so it's not that it's got to be this or that. It could be there could be all hosts of reasons that God commands what He does, but it's the actual command that gives rise to the obligation. And so hopefully that, and do we all see how that solves the dilemma? We're offering a separate solution, a separate option, C, to the dilemma, and saying that that's actually a false dilemma. It's not a choice between A or not A. It's a choice between A or B. And so all we've got to do is offer some other option, option C. And if C works, then we have a good solution to the dilemma. And so we can avoid that concern altogether. So any other comments or questions on this subject? It's a really interesting subject, right? And again, it is a very, very common objection that we see to theistic ethics. And it is a question that arises in the context of the moral argument for God's existence, which is, and I'll just repeat, it's an argument that we'll be covering in the next few weeks, for God's existence from the existence of objective moral obligations. Hey, baby. Yeah. Hey. Come here, baby. Oh, come here. So do we have any other comments or questions? I'll just hold her here.
Yeah, this is a very...
So we understand the dilemma, right? We covered that first. So we understand the supposed dilemma between A or B. And then we've got another option that we offered there.
So you gave an example, being a doctor, that you're not obligated to,
right?
But you take an oath,
right?
Saying that these are the things, and code of ethics. So you say that code of ethics would be the command, the process.
The code of ethics for the law, that would just be something implemented by whatever association that is that put that in place.
I'm just saying, would it be an analogy regarding, okay, you're going to be a doctor, we understand that. We got to go through a certain process to be a doctor. However, am I obligated to save lives? Yes, because of the code of ethics, because of what I know that I have to do.
You could say that, and so that you could still have reasons that you should save people's lives, but you're not obligated as a doctor to do that unless you have this code of ethics that's in place by the board of whatever association. That's another example that we could use. I still like the one of the smoking, the not to smoke in a certain area, and that obligation, that legal obligation, doesn't arise until it's put in place or it's implemented by the law, right? You still have those reasons. Those reasons were there all along. It's always bad to smoke around other people when secondhand smoke can cause cancer. And so you still have those reasons, but it's not a legal obligation until it's actually implemented by the law, right? And so that would be the difference there. And that helps explain that option C, is that God has reasons for commanding what he does, but those reasons are not sufficient in themselves to explain moral obligations. Is that God's commands or God's will is what constitutes that moral obligation. And there's a technical name for this view. It's called divine command theory. And this is a theory in metaethics. Metaethics is the broader, the grounding of ethics, the grounding of morality. And so it's a theory in metaethics, which says that morality, our obligations are grounded in God's will. Somehow they're either identical to God's command or God's will, or they're grounded in it somehow. God's commands might cause these moral obligations to arise. So there's different ways to construe it, but the technical name for it is divine command theory, and that's the theory of ethics that I personally hold, or I lean towards. And so a divine command theory, the way that the moral argument operates is basically to say that we do have these moral obligations. We all know that we are obligated to do certain things, right? I know that I'm obligated to make sure that Cammie stays alive. I'm obligated. It would be morally wrong, and some of these examples that we get can seem really just completely abhorrent. And you look at a lot of the things that's happening in ISIS, okay? So let's use that example. So a lot of these beheadings and these horrible tragedies that are happening over there, we look at that and we can say that this is objectively morally wrong, what is happening over here. Okay, and so if we accept that it's objectively morally wrong, objective is to say that it's not merely a matter of opinion. It's not my opinion that it's morally wrong. It's literally objectively wrong for everyone, no matter what their opinion is. If the Nazis had taken over completely over Europe and over the rest of the world, it would still be morally wrong what they did to the Jews, even though the majority opinion would be that it was good, right? It would still be objectively wrong, despite who was in power, what the consensus of the culture was at that time. And so the argument is basically to say that there are these objective moral facts, but the only way to get an objective moral fact is by a divine command, is through God. And so if that is true, then God exists. Okay? That's the basic, the gist of the argument. We're going to look at it in depth. Really in depth, because it's one of the most fascinating arguments. The reason why is because we all understand morality pretty much. We all understand, and we experience it every day. We all have moral experience. When we say that this isn't fair, we're not saying that this is my opinion, really, that it's not fair. It's like, okay, that's not fair. That's objectively not fair. So we all have this moral experience. And so it hits us right at home, this argument. So if there are these objective moral facts, where do they come from? Why do they exist? If atheism is true, who or what is making us, have these moral obligations, right? And so that's the sort of question that we'll address. It's a really fascinating argument. So, any other questions or comments on the Euthyphro dilemma, the scriptures that we covered on divine holiness? All right, well, let's go ahead and close out. We'll end a little bit early today. So God, we thank you for another day that we can come together and learn more about who you are and what you are. And today we also talked about the content of your holiness, which is that you are perfectly loving, you are sinless, you are blameless. And this also informs our concept of who you are and how we can understand how great and magnificent and majestic you are, God. And so we thank you for these deep insights that we're learning and we're gleaning in class. And so we thank you for all of this. We thank you for today. We thank you that it won't get too hot outside. But we thank you for everything in the name of Jesus.
It won't get too hot. It's a given. Forecast ready for
I know.
14 Sunday. How they describe it? 14 Sunday.